For years, the relationship looked simple on the surface. One country produced, the other controlled. Canada pumped energy out of the ground, and the United States decided where it went, how fast it moved, and who ultimately benefited. It was never written down as a rule, but everyone understood it. Canada supplied, Washington supervised, and for decades, that arrangement felt permanent. The United States assumed this was stability. Canada understood it as dependence. That difference in interpretation is what led us here. Because what happens when a country that has spent decades operating inside someone else's system quietly builds its own exit? Not through confrontation, not through speeches, not through retaliation, but through steel, ports, and routes that no longer ask for permission. The answer is unfolding now, and Washington is only beginning to understand the cost. For most of modern history, Canadian energy did not truly belong to Canada once it left the ground. Oil, gas, and refined products moved south through American-controlled pipelines, American-regulated terminals, and American legal frameworks. Even when Canada exported, the United States remained the gatekeeper. Geography gave Washington leverage, and leverage became habit. That habit bred complacency. Canada was viewed as predictable, cooperative, safe, a partner that would never disrupt the system because it depended on the system to survive. And as long as energy flowed north to south, that assumption held. Then something subtle changed. There were no emergency meetings, no breaking news alerts, no public confrontation. Instead, a tanker slipped quietly out of a port on Canada's west coast. One shipment, one route, one decision that bypassed an entire century of assumptions. This was not just another export. It was the first clear signal that Canada no longer intended to route its economic future through American infrastructure. That LNG shipment crossing the Pacific did not pass through U.S. pipelines. It did not rely on American terminals. It did not require Washington's approval or oversight. It moved directly from Canadian soil to Asian markets along a shorter, faster, and politically cleaner route. The message was not announced. It was delivered. From that moment forward, something irreversible began. Because once an alternative exists, dependence becomes optional. And once dependence disappears, leverage evaporates. What made this shift especially dangerous for Washington was not the shipment itself, but what it represented. This was not improvisation, it was preparation. Years of quiet planning converging into a single visible outcome. LNG Canada was never designed as a trade project. It was designed as a structural escape. Backed by global energy giants and protected from political volatility, it gave Canada something it had lacked for generations: direct access to global buyers without American mediation. That access changed the equation overnight. While U.S. LNG exports remained tied to congested canals, political bottlenecks, and rising insurance risks, Canadian shipments moved faster, cheaper, and with fewer points of failure. Every day shaved off transit time translated into pricing power. Every route that avoided American jurisdiction reduced exposure to tariffs, threats, and regulatory pressure. This was not a challenge issued to the United States. It was something far more dangerous. It was indifference. As Washington remained locked in debates over tariffs and trade warnings, Ottawa moved in a different direction entirely. Under Mark Carney, the strategy was not to fight louder, but to build quieter. Not to react, but to re-engineer. The Coastal GasLink pipeline was never meant to be the finish line. It was the foundation. A physical statement that Canadian energy no longer had to default southward. A steel artery running west, not as a protest, but as a choice. And then came the move that truly altered the balance. With a single directive, Carney elevated the East-West Energy Corridor to national priority status. That decision did more than fast-track approvals. It stripped the process of its traditional weaknesses. Provincial deadlocks, legal delays, and political obstruction were neutralized under federal authority. This was not confrontation, it was insulation. Canada had learned from its past failures. The endless litigation around Trans Mountain had exposed how infrastructure could be weaponized by delay. This time, the approach was different. Indigenous communities were not sidelined. They were integrated. Ownership stakes replaced courtroom battles. Binding agreements replaced temporary concessions. The result was something rare in modern infrastructure development: momentum. No rolling protests, no injunctions, no paralysis, just continuous progress. And from Washington's perspective, that progress is deeply unsettling. Because once pipelines stop pointing south by default, control over supply dissolves. The United States does not lose access overnight. it loses priority. And in energy markets, priority is everything. For decades, more than 3 million barrels of Canadian oil flowed daily into the American Midwest. Refineries in Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio were built around that assumption. Pricing models, logistics chains, and profit margins all depended on a supply line that felt guaranteed. But guarantees only exist until alternatives are finished. As new westbound routes come online, Canadian crude gains optionality. It can still move south, but it does not have to. And that distinction changes how negotiations work. Buyers who once assumed preferential access now compete with global markets. If U.S. refineries lose even a fraction of that supply, replacement options become expensive fast. Middle Eastern crude costs more to transport, harder to process, and introduces new geopolitical risk. A few dollars per barrel may seem minor, but multiplied across millions of barrels, the impact reaches into fuel prices, manufacturing costs, and regional inflation. This is how structural power operates: quietly, incrementally, relentlessly. Tariffs, once the favored weapon, suddenly lose relevance in this environment. You cannot tax what no longer needs your route. You cannot threaten a supply chain that has already diversified beyond your reach. That is why tariff announcements no longer move markets the way they once did. When threats of 25%, then 35%, then even extreme figures are floated, the response is muted. Ships keep sailing. Contracts remain intact. Buyers stay calm. Because the leverage has shifted. This is not a trade dispute. It is not retaliation. It is not nationalism. It is a rebalancing of power through infrastructure. And infrastructure does not argue. It does not negotiate. It simply exists. The United States did not lose influence because Canada became hostile. It lost influence because Canada stopped being dependent. While Washington debated, litigated, and delayed, Canada built. Abundant production without distribution is not power. Control over exits is. Asia is no longer Canada's alternative market. It is becoming the primary one. The Pacific is no longer a barrier. It is a corridor. And U.S. energy dominance, once assumed permanent, now competes in a world where permission is no longer required. History has seen this pattern before. Power fades not when empires collapse, but when systems outgrow the structures that once supported them. The loudest voices often notice last. So the real question is no longer whether tariffs can force compliance or whether old pressure tactics still work. The question is whether Washington can adapt to a world where its traditional leverage has already been bypassed. Because when pipelines change direction, politics follows. And once infrastructure is in the ground, the future does not ask for approval. It simply moves forward.